Let's dive in. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar, The Audiences of AI, Who's Actually Using It. So I'm thrilled to kind of have you all here, have our guests here as we dive into one of the kind of most transformative, revolutionary topics of our time. The future has arrived. AI is no longer a concept of the future, of course, it's kind of part of our daily lives, but to what extent we'll be exploring today. We're looking at a study by Oxford later on that you might have seen in some of our material before, but I think I'll hold off before we dive in. But yeah, so obviously impact of AI is global, and we've got these guests here today who are going to be diving in. I mean, like even my Netflix recommendations apparently are being powered by AI now, and I got an email the other day about my bank using AI and their like fraud detection systems. So I think that we can all agree AI is absolutely everywhere. And we're here today to discuss who's using it and how many of us interact with it daily, often without realizing it, which is a bit of a spoiler alert for later. So I'll hold off. Right, before we dive in and meet the guests, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Pulsar. So all the data that you'll see today is primarily from Pulsar. But what is Pulsar and who are we? So I'm obviously not just going to read this slide at you. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that at any point. That's kind of a bit boring. But we gather conversational data from all across the internet. So that's sources such as social sources like X, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Reddit, TikTok, many more. We also offer sources such as Google search, online news, forums, blogs, podcasts, broadcast data from television and radio. I kind of run out of breath when I'm doing that list. We're offering the opportunity to see the conversations on the internet and realize the impossible task, which is reading the internet. So yeah, this allows brands to kind of analyze their audiences, its sub-audiences, as well as answer discrete questions. We offer all that on our platform, and we also have an in-house research department that acts as a consultancy. So let's introduce everyone, shall we? So I'm not on this picture. I'm Sal Morton. I'm content marketing lead at Pulsar. I'm going to be kind of guiding you through today, but these are our real experts that we've got here. So I can't wait to dive into this. So should we just go kind of do a quick round of introduction, guys, before we start? Should we start with Chris? Hello, Chris.
Hello. Yeah, this is me looking a bit more younger and a little bit less overweight after lockdown. My name is Chris Stokel-Walker. I'm a journalist for a bunch of different places. Like you, Sal, I run out of breath whenever I try and explain it, but some of them include The Economist, New Scientist, and Wired, and also the author of a book called How AI Ate the World, which was out last month, and tries to explain the past, present, and future of this current AI moment that we're in.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm really excited to kind of get in more detail about your book and about what we've got to say today. Mackenzie, hello, nice to see you.
Hello, everyone. Excited to be here with you all. My name's Mackenzie Soji. I am an AI and foreign influence editor at NewsGuard, which is a media and misinformation watchdog, overseeing a lot of our work on the impact AI is having in the news.
Thank you, Mackenzie. I'm really excited to get into what you're going to be telling us later in the presentation as well. And Fran, hello. I can notice you're already in the chat, Fran. You're talking to an AI bot as we speak in the Zoom chat.
Yes, we're doing the intro. AI assistant of Ben Robbins, who's also a friend, popped up saying, "Hi, I'm an AI assistant helping Ben take notes for this meeting."
So, amazing. So you've introduced yourself to Ben. Introduce yourself to us, Fran. Who are you?
Yeah, a co-founder and CEO of Pulsar. Pulsar is kind of like the work I've been doing for the last 14 years now, like before and after launching it. And I got a PhD in social science, and I've specialized in figuring out how culture evolves and using the web to try and measure that. So over the years, I've been experimenting with different ways of analyzing that data, but the game is trying to understand where society moving using digital data, basically. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Fran. And I didn't realize that I always forget about your PhD, and I should always be putting Dr. Francesca. I'm so sorry.
I don't put it in. I find it embarrassing when people do. I just mention it to say that I come from research rather than from marketing or analytics, and I picked up those things as a mean to do research, and that's really important to me because it's not just a tech play; it's a research play.
That's what we say about Pulsar, isn't it? By researchers for researchers. It's a very good everlasting tagline. Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. So today, this is just a bit of a contents page. So we'll be examining the audience of AI and who's actually using it through a few different lenses. So first of all, we've got a bit of a journey back through time with some snapshots of audiences throughout the ages. That will really help us contextualize the wider conversation that we're going to be talking about and seeing today. After that, we'll be looking at AI in education. So that's a bit of a case study diving into one industry in an area where audiences are already using AI in really different ways. So I've got some really pretty charts there, if I say so myself, as well to show you, which will be good. And throughout those two sections as well, our expert guests will be adding commentary. So it won't just be a load of me speaking at you. And finally, we have a presentation from Mackenzie on AI misinformation that audiences are being exposed to and the implications of that worldwide. Really excited for that. And then, of course, we'll be doing a Q&A. So please do add your questions in the question box as we go. No question too big or too small. We aim to answer everyone. And so if there's anything that we don't get to during the webinar, we'll always try and email you back afterwards where possible. So yeah, pop your questions in the box or the chats or wherever you want to pop your questions. Yeah, brilliant. So let's dive in, shall we? So this is a study done by Oxford. There's some kind of key numbers here from there. So this study it made quite a lot of headlines. 2% of people in the UK using ChatGPT daily. That rises to 7% in the USA. This study was over 12,000 people across these 6 countries, which are kind of quite dotted around the world, but obviously not. This isn't a global study by any means. Yeah, and a lot of people have heard of ChatGPT, about half of people, that's half of the public, and about just over half of young people have used ChatGPT once. I mean, Fran, just before we kind of dive deeper into this, I mean, what do you make of these numbers? Because my first thought is that no one's going to ask what you're not telling them.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's definitely that, but that's down to the, every research methodology has got some issues that tries to balance out by tweaking the methodology in a way that kind of like resolves the bias that is the bias of survey data. You got to ask the question if you want an answer, so you're never going to know what you don't know. But I think the problem, I found this study really interesting because it comes as a counterpoint to the general narrative that this is the technology that has seen the fastest adoption curve in the history of technology, where you get to 100 million users in the space of days. And, that's a super interesting, but then the counterpoint of that is, are you actually using this daily? Because if you're not using this daily, this hasn't really made its way into your workflow and your habits. And so granted, it takes time for habits to form, but it's a nice counterpoint to bear in mind in terms of understanding how deep into society and culture this is versus it being a narrative that exists within certain circles and that is dominating the news cycle, but is not necessarily yet there as a mainstream innovation and kind of like shift. But the other thing that is happening that I find quite interesting is that this kind of way of measuring whether people use AI or not is going to be less and less effective as we move into the next phase of AI. And to me, any technology that has to do with media has effectively 2 stages of development in terms of like how it interfaces with society. There's always a phase 1 where the medium is focused on the wonder of the technology itself. And then there's a phase 2 where the technology becomes a tool and the focus becomes the language that it enables. If you think about like cinema is a really good example there, where this dynamic, you go from short form reels that at the end of the 19th century were kind of like the main kind of like output of cinema, and everything was focused on specific scenes and the tech spectacles. And then you move forward like 12, 15 years and you get to effectively the invention of narrative with long form features. And that's the key leap that happens within the Lumiere brothers and David Griffiths, for example, with The Birth of a Nation in like 1912. I think we're kind of like entering the second stage in AI, where effectively the technology ceases to be the focus of attention and it becomes embedded and invisible. So AI is going through this phase now where you start from the wonder of being able to chat to a seemingly human intelligence through a chat interface with a specific chat website that you go to, and that's just that. Then you move on to using Google or using your Apple iPhone, and you're doing the things that you do normally, but now in the background, AI is solving those queries and giving you an answer. So you can more and more probably measure adoption in terms of who's using what, because more Android users and Apple users and Google users are going to be users of AI very soon, just without knowing it. We already have a name for this. It's called invisible AI. So
yeah, I was going to say that sounds like the kind of invisibilification of AI moving into the background in a way that the internet did as well. I mean, yeah.
yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting, just to leap on the back of that, and I should say, as the author of someone who wrote a book that titles it How AI Ate the World, and then looking at these data points, it's really interesting what Fran says in terms of, I think those two things can be simultaneously true, is that it can be the fastest growing app in history at the time, and then it's the stickiness that hasn't existed yet, because actually we're still in that kind of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks phase of generative AI, where we don't know what the killer use case is necessarily. And so there'll be a good number of people who used it, thought, actually, this isn't really much beyond a little toy that I can play with, and then will have gone away from it. And I think that, you know, we're seeing lots of developments. I know we're going to move on to things like Apple and so on. Their involvement in the AI space could potentially change us quite a lot as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to get more in depth about that. This study also had like a really big focus around journalism and AI news. Mackenzie, there's some statistics here at the bottom of the page about people's belief in what journalists are using AI for. Now, this isn't what journalists are actually using AI for, it's what people's belief is. So I know this is a little bit different to what we'll be diving into later, but what do you make, Mackenzie, of these audience perceptions?
I think they're in line with what's playing out right now. I think we're increasingly starting to see publications like Bloomberg and the Associated Press use AI in some level in the content generation process, echoing what everyone else said. At the same time, though, I think we're still in this sort of experimental phase where newsrooms and journalists are testing out how AI can aid the news gathering and production process and sort of seeing what sticks and what doesn't, and using it as a means to aid the reporting and the news that they're generating rather than replacing it entirely.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of a quite apt reflection of this study in terms of how those credible news sources are using AI right now. So it's kind of very obvious that AI is having these huge reverberations around the world. There's countless ways AI has changed our lives already, and as we've talked about, the perceptions and conscious use of AI as well. So Chris here actually wrote a book on this, a whole entire book. Critics are calling this a must-read for anyone who is impacted by AI tech, which I say is everyone in the world. So yeah, we've got a bit of a snapshot here that kind of illustrates this is a bit of a very quick snapshot in terms of when I was doing this research. This is where the AI conversation was happening on X in one day. So this is just one day of conversation last month kind of grabbed, and it just kind of shows you how everywhere it is and also where the concentration are at. And this is, I mean, this is also primarily English language conversation, so there must be much more out there that I didn't grab in my little snapshot. But yeah, Chris, tell us a little bit about the scope and the research that is in your book.
Yeah, I think it's, and this slide is interesting. I'm kind of just looking through it and thinking of all of the potential ramifications, the level of conversation in India and the way that they're thinking about that as a production goal, potentially, the focus on the UK and North America. Now we have, I think, it looks like Ghana is using it an awful lot, which I'm kind of intrigued by as well in terms of what's happening. The book essentially is an attempt to try and situate, I suppose, whether or not the hype matches the reality here. And Francesco and I talked in the podcast as well, which you should definitely listen to. It's a really interesting conversation, and Fran asked me lots of really thought-provoking questions that kind of got me thinking about AI use in a way that I hadn't maybe thought about before. But the thing is, we've had
I asked you at the end.
exactly, precisely, where I was just gobsmacked and didn't know what I was going to say. But I guess the thing is, we've had kind of 70 years of AI as AI. The term was invented back in 1956, and basically since 1956, we've had people promising that this is the revolutionary technology that's going to change our lives, and it's just around the corner and just coming tomorrow. And, to a certain extent, cynics might think, well, is this just the case here? But obviously we've got, many, many people, dozens of you signed up to this webinar and giving your time this afternoon to listen to us talking about this. So maybe you think there isn't a kind of cynic's case for this, and actually this is different. And my argument, I think, is that this is different, in part because of the ubiquity of it, in part because of how this is such a global phenomenon, although it is interesting the points where there isn't really much data or there isn't really much conversation, and the kind of extractive nature of AI more generally, and the sort of imbalances that it can often provoke, which are often kind of similar to the ones that we've had before. I often think of AI as kind of like, particularly generative AI, as a bit of a fun house mirror. It kind of amplifies the worst bits and kind of nips in the best bits and makes us look better in some ways and worse in others. But the book is essentially an attempt to try and make the argument of why this time is different, why this is kind of potentially transformative, and then also how you live alongside this, because I think that is one of the big challenges. This is hugely disruptive in terms of what it does, and we have to be aware of, like, how do we actually prepare ourselves for what this new and AI-enabled world looks like.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think it's very interesting as well. You mentioned the conversation that you had in the podcast with Fran. So that podcast, keep your eyes out. Fran hosts the Audiences podcast, which is a podcast that looks at the past, present, and future of an audience. So we actually did some research for that podcast episode. So we looked at the audience of AI with Chris, and also the research department here at Pulsar, and we looked at the audience of AI, how it's developed, and where it's going next. And do keep your eyes out for that, and ears, I guess. That's how podcasts work, for that when it comes out, and listen to our other incredible episodes. And I may be biased because I do produce it, but I think it's the best podcast out there. I think that is very biased, but yeah. So we just wanted to go through these 3 snapshots. So this is a day in the life of the AI audience in these 3 years that you can see in front of you. So just a snapshot, because I think even though we've got incredible computing power, I think I don't have time to look through millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of results personally for myself to go through the whole year. So this is a fun snapshot. Fran, we undertook this research obviously as part of our upcoming episode of Audience of AI. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to look at these 3 years in particular, and kind of your overarching thoughts around this before I get into more detail.
Yeah, so we just wanted to have a general sense of where the audience that is actually getting involved in discussing AI is at 3 different moments in time. So two caveats here. One is that the reason why we're looking at this data, the people that talk about AI, is because it's quite important to understand the audience that is actively engaging with a new technology, because that audience ends up being the actor that negotiates how that technology gets deployed, gets accepted into society, gets shaped for development, gets integrated into legal frameworks. So the specifics of that audience are quite telling of where things are going to go. And then obviously we also wanted to see how mainstream is that audience. And so what we do at Pulsar is we look at the conversation behind the topic, and then we look at the audience that is having that conversation and segment that audience into clusters of people that are similar to each other. So the combination of these 2 elements gives us a nice understanding of the context of that conversation. And we picked these 3 years because they roughly map onto big kind of like development milestones in the AI community. So 2014 is the age of AI getting relatively mainstream without the enterprise space. So it's a piece of tech that mainly sits under machine learning, and it sits into kind of like data science techniques to make sense of data. Some of them, not all of them, obviously. And it's very specific to what the enterprise can do with large amounts of data. So this is more like AI is an enabler of big data analysis. 2019 is just enough time to see the impact of something big that happened in 2017, which is the release of a paper about transformers, which are the technology at the core of the generative AI revolution. So in 2019, you start seeing the people that are involved in the industry that understand the implications of the transformers paper. And obviously, this is still pre the commercialization of a large kind of like audience type product like ChatGPT, but it's after the community has discussed and started to envision the implication of a new way of processing data with a new architecture like transformers. And 2024 is roughly 1.5 years, 2 years after the release of the infamous ChatGPT, where not even the board of OpenAI knew that it was going to release because they thought it was just an experiment, and they just wrapped the chat interface around a model that they had in the garage for a while. To be noted, actually, at the time when they released that, apparently Anthropic also, the makers of Claude, they already had a model in production ready to be released, and they decided not to release it for concerns over the safety and the implications of the release. So these three snapshots are telling us what happens at 3 moments in time of the evolution of what we understand as being AI. So what we found really interesting here is that there's obviously some, let's say, morphological considerations of these networks. You see the network on the right-hand side tends to be a lot more cohesive than the networks on the left-hand side. And that happens when you see a catalyst in the conversation, and therefore the audience is participating in conversations that are like not insular, but tend to be more widespread across different types of people. What you see more of in the left hand side maps is that the 2014 and 2019 is that the segments are more segregated. And so these are like disparate communities that are not involved in any catalyst movement and any catalyst moment of attention. And they're just discussing AI within the respects of their own use cases. Now, that you would expect that catalyst to bring those communities together and to reduce the fragmentation in the audience as you go into a more mainstream configuration. But what we didn't see in the 2024 that we did expect was a much more mainstream composition of those segments. So effectively in 2014 and 2019, you still have something that is pretty extremely business focused, specifically in tech and marketing. What you see in 2024 is that you start seeing some new communities popping up, like the healthcare community, the crypto community. I mean, the crypto community is like it's a bit of a running joke at point, but I think there's a lot going on there. But in terms of like the community and how insular that is, that's an interesting topic in its own right. But then you start seeing more kind of like applications in science, applications in the media. So you start seeing a broadening of the areas of AI impact, but it's still pretty much a conversation by people that work in certain professions that are looking at how AI is changing those professions. It's definitely not a mainstream audience grappling with a discussion on AI. And that's why we found it really interesting when we produced this and then looked at the Oxford study, seeing that only 2% of people actually use it daily. That checked out. It's like, okay, this is something that now is quite confined, not confined, but it's like, this is the daily life for us that work in this industry, have to do with data, have to do with tech, have to do with specific impacts in certain professions, but it's definitely not something for the mainstream audience yet. And we should remind ourselves of that.
Definitely. I think it's very interesting that you say that it reflects the study, because that's something that I hadn't initially thought of when we ran this. Because, I mean, I'm going to pass us through maybe a bit more quickly here through each audience. you know, as Fran pointed out, these lower levels of interconnectedness, and there's some kind of example tweets down the bottom about, you know, in 2014, you know, obviously, Chris, I think it was in 1956 that you said that AI was first coined. It's still here. People are talking about AI as a very hypothetical thing. If human motive.
Someone made a comment this week on the naming of artificial intelligence as being just a fundraising convention, just to from investment bankers at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. That's something that I've been going around and saying as part of my book tour, is that it was essentially a masterclass of branding, because there were lots of disparate fields of researchers focusing on what we now know as artificial intelligence, but they were called things like automata studies, and they couldn't come together on an umbrella term. And then they eventually did, and someone unearthed this video of Claude Shannon, who is one of the fathers of AI. There are many mothers of AI as well, but they're often overlooked in the history books of this stuff, saying essentially we did that in order to get funding, and they did. And what happens when you get a kind of snazzy title around stuff is that you start to get lots of money coming in, and so that essentially triggered a series of cycles of what we call AI summers and AI winters, where AI summers were lots of money was coming in from research groups and things like that, allowing them to do the work, but then they came up against these hardware limitations, which caused the funding to then go away for a generation or so. So yeah, it was interesting to see that video coming up on social media this week.
That's so interesting about the winters, because it seems like the winters and summers, as you described them, because from what Fran was telling us about this audience as well, you can see this audience booms into various techie industries, and this is where we see the kind of turnaround of the those transformers being able to. I'm not a computer scientist, so when I say transformers, I think you can all see it in my eyes. So I don't know what transformers means, but I know. Okay, maybe I know what transformer means. But this kind of more techie focus, where we're still not seeing GPT, LLM type stuff being talked about, like conversational tools, but this technical language really starts to be kind of pushed through the conversation, and it's kind of branching out a little bit here into industry focus, digital healthcare. I mean, cloud tech even was an industry. I mean, obviously cloud tech kind of is one of those things that we have brought into our day-to-day lives, but the emergence of cloud tech as a viable option, so for example, streaming gaming, for example, being something that wasn't possible through cloud tech even in 2019, so or at scale at least. So it's very reflective of the time, and this it seems like 2019 perhaps now has been a bit of one of those summers, as you said. The journey with 2024, we start to see, like Fran says, we've got these crypto. I mean, obviously crypto is going to pop up in every conversation. We're going to always try and kind of rinse it out, but they're popping up and they're talking about AI. Because AI is such a loud conversation now, this is where we're seeing AI being rendered invisible. So we're seeing things, you know, we're seeing AI gaming, gambling apps, AI friendship apps, AI money-making schemes, all of these things kind of popping up as people kind of start to use, I think, like you said, it's like a masterclass in branding. You say something's got AI and it's kind of getting clicks and it's getting looked at. We can see a lot of powerful emotive language around AI now, like this: AI gaming is inevitable. Sign up and let's change the game together. And I think, I'm not even sure if this is a real game or just some kind of crypto scam, but was one of the most highly engaged tweets in this conversation, in this snapshot. So, and then there's a tweet that I included here that I just thought was funny, because I think I kind of agree. I got to confess that I'm listening to Patrick AI covers of songs. They always sound so good. That's the Patrick from SpongeBob AI covers that are everywhere on TikTok and social media, to hearing your, you know, a funny cartoon character sing your favorite songs. No, it sounds good. And this is kind of in AI entertainment coming into the mainstream, but as Fran said, not quite being part of that mainstream conversation just yet, still being very techie, tech focused, tech startup, that kind of stuff. And Mackenzie, there's something here in this audience that I kind of wanted to ask about, which is the US news and media segment, which is right at the top in blue. I know you'll be diving a little bit into this later, so I don't want to kind of jump the gun, but could you tell us a little bit about the presence of AI in politics, as it's kind of being used as a bit of a pawn in this election year, somewhat?
Yeah, with AI and news and politics, we're seeing a lot of discussion and this sort of being framed as the first major election year where AI is being used. And as you know, we've mentioned this has been around for a while, but I think because there's been more attention and awareness around the issue, it's really playing a significant role. We're seeing different campaigns use AI for their videos to promote their issues or causes and the kind of ethical considerations that are at play there. So in the news side of it, we've seen a really big focus on that as well.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay. I was just taking some water from my Bratz water bottle, I think that someone referred to it as earlier, painfully on brand for this summer. Yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting to talk about the emergence of AI being used by politicians and also being used as a pawn by politicians to talk about various different things. I mean, as we go in to look at the industry, so this isn't the snapshot. This is the full range of the year 2014, 2019, 2024 as well. When we look at the kind of areas that are being affected in the AI conversation. So this is AI and tech, AI and the creative industries. I mean, it's obvious that in 2024 and 2019, the tech is the highest industry associated with AI. I think that's not surprising anyone. When we do look down here, though, we can see the growth of politics going kind of increasing tenfold, 15-fold, I think actually is what I found. And it's similar to the increase in finance as well. We've got a kind of AI in areas that AI weren't originally being thought to play a part in. We can see in 2014, and really the only places that have got any interest are creative industries, which have always been impacted by the AI conversation, and sports sticking out massively. Now, why is sports sticking out massively here and then disappearing? It's the only one that's disappearing. Well, that was when FIFA World Cup first brought in the AI-assisted camera usage to be able to kind of figure out, you can tell I'm a big football fan, where the ball is and who scored the goal. I think that's the technical term. But so it was a huge uproar in 2014. Obviously, it's similar now. Is a lot of people hating on VAR, but they will not be calling it AI because it's kind of embedded itself into this invisibilification again, which is a word that we're coining today in this webinar. I hope that Webster's is watching. And yeah, so let's move on to talk a bit about the other industries that we can see in this chart. So creative industries coming in second in 2024, mainly powered by the SAG-AFTRA strike and discourse around that. So that was creatives in across the world, but primarily in the US, striking due to, among other things, pay and the usage of AI in the creation of entertainment. So that might be script writers that are interested in that, or it could be actors who are worried about their likeness being taken. So, however, when we get to number 3, education, that's in 2024, the story is a little bit less obvious. So we wanted to kind of deep dive into this and have a look at education. So here I'm going to take us very quickly through a bit of a case study that we've done about AI.
Quick question
on
the data. Did we search for anything war and weapon related? In terms
war and
of
weapon?
defensive?
No, because war and weapon related conversation at the moment is a little bit noisy and maybe a little bit difficult to separate out, but would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, because I think a lot of investment in deep tech has gone in that direction when it comes to AI, but obviously the stuff we talk about every day is tech and creative industries, news and education and finance sometimes.
Yeah,
there's a belly to that conversation also that is quite big.
Well, I'll pop you those numbers afterwards, and anyone who else wants to see those numbers, to just get in touch and pop a question in the question box as well. If there's a particular industry that you think that maybe we haven't gone over, if you have any industry specific questions, we've got a wealth of knowledge between our expert guests here. So please do pop in the question box. I can see that some people have already, so we'll definitely be getting to those. Thanks, Fran. But unfortunately, rather than going into war, I'm going into education now, which I'd always Of the two to go into personally, I'd always rather go into do another degree rather than go to war, despite what Rishi Sunak might be trying to make the young population of the UK do. So here we have the conversation around AI in education. What this is showing is that on social media and in Google search data, it's absolutely on the rise. So this mirrors what we saw in the audience conversation from before, and just kind of shows how important it is. So ChatGPT, this is no surprise to anyone, is the most mentioned AI tool in the conversation. Then we also have OpenAI in general being mentioned, Midjourney as well as an image generation tool, and Bard Gemini, Google's kind of rival ChatGPT. It's like the Bing of GPT-like conversational tools. But that doesn't tell the whole story. So let's have a look at absolutely every tool. So here are the most common AI tools put through the AI in education conversation. And that we see that despite ChatGPT and DALL-E taking, these huge big blockbuster names taking up a huge amount of this chart here, we see this very interesting point in purple here, taking up a good chunk of the conversation. This is tools for educators. So these may include many tools that I hadn't heard of, and you may not have ever heard of either. Maybe if you use these, but this is kind of going to show the level of which the educators are getting into the act of using AI. So yes, people might be talking about students' use of ChatGPT, use of kids are going to be using ChatGPT for their homework. Well, some of the biggest unis in the world are now encouraging people to use ChatGPT for their assignments, saying, "Go on, show us what it can do. Then integrate this into your sources. Integrate this."
I mean, what I found amazing here is how well Grammarly managed to sneak into that, even though it's obviously not a Gen AI product, but they managed to jump on the AI train quite early on, and they managed to position themselves in that mix. That's really good. And in the next slide, I actually have no idea what any of those tools do. I've never.
Yeah, I haven't interacted with any of these tools either. Chris, if you, I know that you do some education. I mean, Mackenzie, if you've interacted with these tools, I don't know, they're quite niche. Have you seen any of these before?
One thing that sticks out to me is Grammarly. I think one reason it may be popping up here is that I've seen at least a lot of people using the tool to detect AI in news by using plagiarism checker.
That's very interesting. So that's maybe a lot of teachers and educators speaking to each other saying, "Hey, I'm using Grammarly to check for that." And what about these purple ones? Based off this, Chris, what are you seeing in these kind of smaller, more niche tools that are popping up that people are interacting with?
Yeah, I think there's often, I mean, things like quizzes and Canmigo, I think are kind of both more kind of quiz based tools. The clue's kind of in the name, and one of the things that education likes to do. My sins also teach at a university alongside doing journalism and writing books, and there are some people who are very, very keen to try and adopt new ways of engaging people in technology, particularly post-pandemic, as we start to have more things like this, and actually you have bolt-on tools like this. Canva, for instance, is a really big thing in our university that I teach at. So it's unsurprising to me that this sort of thing is happening. There is also this really interesting conversation happening at universities of, I think you had Winston down at the bottom, and then there are lots of other sort of plagiarism detectors that supposedly are able to detect AI generated content, whether or not they actually can or not. There's a couple of ways that you can commonly detect this stuff, which is one of the terminologies is burstiness, which is kind of the variation in language that you have, and then I forget what the other one is called, but there's kind of two telltale signs that these AI generated text detectors try to use. And there is this kind of cat and mouse game, I suppose, going on where universities are on the hoof trying to decide, much as the journalism industry is, what their policy is going to be on this stuff, and not really having a conclusion as yet.
I think that's really interesting to note because it just is another layer to the story of, well, 2% using an AI ChatGPT daily, but the other, this is one of many products out there, and the people participating in that survey, they may not know that their children interacted with 4 or 5 different AI products that same day, via their teacher, via their classroom, or also other facets as well. So very interesting to see the different ways in which we can interact with AI. I wanted to show you this very briefly, the AI education conversation. This kind of takes us in a different branch of conversation slightly, but what we can see here is some geographic variation. So you can see in yellow here, South Asian AI fans. This is the audience that has the least interconnectivity between these. I've been showing you a lot of these, but I just thought I'd point out that the dot is the kind of multiplicitness and the size of the audience, and the lines are the interconnectedness of these different segments. I think they're quite intuitive to look at, and they've got pretty colors. But I just thought I'd hammer that home before I go into a little bit more depth. So I mean, Chris, you've talked a little bit about South Asian use and specifically in India coming up in the snapshot chart that I showed you before. And I just thought it was interesting that this is happening across different niche audiences as well, but showing kind of a low interconnectivity. The real standout story for me here is who's using AI. I use this to have a look. Who's using AI? So education researchers, a lot of their tweets are kind of fearful. There's a how can we be using this? It's quite kind of like that 2019 audience. How would I be using this if this was a thing? Whereas tech innovators, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead to one of the questions that we've got, but kind of talking about the people that are using like this, they're kind of the early adopters. We're jumping ahead with this section of tech innovators who are talking about here are actual practical applications of this in the classroom, and even if they're maybe not hitting the nail on the head every single time, it's very interesting indeed. I want to show you now, similar to the industries, because who's powering the industries of tomorrow? The children of the world. So I thought I'd do a kind of industry chart through educational subjects. There's so much to say here, and I don't want to get into it incredibly. But as we can see, EdTech leaders are really like bounding ahead into the math space, whereas religious conservatives are kind of very focused on vocational education. So this is worrying about AI mechanics. Literally, there's a huge amount of false news in there, which is so interesting to look at. Keep an eye out for this piece coming in the coming weeks, because we go into depth of all these different audiences and more. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of point out the variances here in just how many different areas that the children that are at school today will be taking this knowledge of kind of AI into their workforces in various different industries. Especially interestingly in maths and computer science, and the visual arts as well. Right, without please.
Peter Thiel quote that went viral a couple of weeks ago, I think, on how he thinks that this wave of AI is going to rebalance the power between words people and numbers people in Silicon Valley. And his point was, because maths is becoming embedded into these conversational interfaces, you're actually going to you're probably going to see a shift from the focus on numbers people to the focus on words people, as in people with a humanistic background, because that math problem in most of the instances has been solved by the AI, whereas the humanistic side of the problem is where the human expertise is actually still required, and where AI can actually have the same impact.
It's interesting again to go back to that 2% figure and think about how, and wonder, how that will affect in the years to come when things like that occur, when people are using these.
Yeah, although that statement also clashes with the evidence that when AI is taken through the classic tests, so like how many dots are on this page, if there are 7 dots, the AI would say there's 3. And then you have to argue with it about why there's 7 instead of 3. Look, there are some basic maths that are still not working there, because it's not obviously a knowledge system. It's more like a statistical system. So math is not necessarily supported by the principle of maths, more like predicting that answer is, in some cases is a maths answer. But interesting to see
It's
what
like talking to a very, very, very clever 3-year-old. They're still going to be 3 years old. Yeah. Without further ado, I want to introduce Mackenzie's kind of section of the presentation. This is all about misinformation and AI. Obviously AI and misinformation conversations go hand in hand. This is just the education, just kind of staying within that education conversation. We had a 5% misinformation rate in terms of the news sources that we saw being from non-credible sources. That's really high. And this is, I think, because it involves the emotive subject of children as well in terms of education. But we were seeing it pop up in all kinds of conversations, including those that are completely not really related directly to AI, such as the general sustainability conversation, having AI.
I think we need to explain this. Just
go for it, yeah.
Tiny bit of explanation on this one. So when we analyze data in Pulsar, where it comes from news or from social, when the data is news specific, we integrate NewsGuard ratings into our analysis. NewsGuard ratings is providing us with what they call a nutrition label that tells us whether the outlet that is publishing the content is credible or not, based on 9 indicators that are kind of like assessed by journalists, humans, that define whether that outlet is correcting errors when those errors are flagged to them, or whether it's disclosing their sources of funding, or whether they have published misinformation before. So there's 9 criteria like that tell us whether an outlet is credible or not. And then what we do is we apply that rating to the content that we're seeing. So when we see that less than 5% of the conversation is coming from outlets that are non-credible, we think that we have a data set that is relatively kind of like safe. When we see that there's more than 5% of the conversation coming from non-credible data sources, the benchmark tells us that that data set is unusual and is like kind of like over-indexing in terms of non-credible sources. And in this case, we have a data set that has more than 5% when it comes to AI and education. More than 5% of the sources that contribute to this data set are not credible, which is quite high compared to the benchmarks that we have.
Thanks so much, Fran. You know what? I get so into the weeds with this research that I kind of sometimes glaze over those really big obvious things. Thank you for taking us through that. I'm going to hand over to you now, Mackenzie, to kind of take us through these slides in terms of the ways that AI and misinformation interact.
Yeah. So when we talk about who's using AI, a lot of what our research has shown is that bad actors are primarily weaponizing this technology, and it's playing a big role in the misinformation landscape. There's basically 3 different ways that we've observed AI is playing a big role when it comes to news and misinformation. First, AI tools have been found to readily repeat falsehoods, which tech companies like to refer to as hallucinations, where they make up nonsensical answers and made up facts. And second, we're already seeing instances of foreign state actors increasingly using AI technology for their disinformation campaigns to make them seem more detailed and convincing and realistic. And lastly, we've observed this large proliferation of news and information websites that are entirely generated by AI with little to no human oversight, in an attempt to earn financial revenue. So as Fran mentioned earlier, we rate these websites on different criteria points, and we're seeing a lot of these AI-produced news and information sources are performing very low and rated with low scores due to their practice of relying on AI so much. So our research on some of these large language models has found that the leading chatbots very easily repeat falsehoods, and this goes back to, the ethical considerations of AI being used in classrooms or in the media when they repeat false claims or are citing sources that are unreliable, that becomes problematic. So we found that a lot of these chatbots still have a long way to go when it comes to being factually reliable about news topics. And we're increasingly seeing this growing trend where bad actors are using AI to create news sites entirely from scratch. A couple of months ago, we conducted an experiment to show how easy it really is to create these websites. And essentially what we found was that it only took $105 and little to no tech skills to create a partisan news site entirely from scratch and code it to pump out partisan content favoring one candidate or one issue. And a lot of this is no longer really hypothetical. We're starting to see real life use cases of this happening. A lot of developers and content creators are launching these portfolios where they're offering clients to create AI generated news sites for them. And we found that these AI-generated news and information sources aren't just limited to random bad actors trying to earn financial ad revenue. We're also seeing foreign state actors starting to use AI in their content creation process. We recently identified a network of over 100 sites posing as reliable news outlets in the UK and the US that were created in Moscow using AI to generate text articles, logos, images. As you can see here, we know that they're using AI because in a lot of cases, there's no human oversight at all, that they're inadvertently leaving these AI error messages on their content. Beyond using AI in the content generation process, we're also seeing foreign media using AI increasingly in the news, inciting conversations or responses from chatbots as an authoritative source to advance disinformation. Here on the left is an instance of Chinese state media citing a conversation supposedly that it had with ChatGPT, which we think was the first instance of a foreign state-controlled media outlet relying on ChatGPT as a source. So a couple years ago, when these AI chatbots started really rolling out to the public, we noticed that a lot of content farms that traditionally relied on human content creators started shifting over to AI. I believe it was in May 2022. Around that time, we noticed 49 websites that were using AI to generate news and information with no human oversight. And since then, that number has continued to really grow on a weekly basis. As of today, it stands at 957, and we're still continuing to find new sites each week. And it's also playing out in pink slime outlets, which are partisan-backed outlets that basically pose themselves as local traditional newspapers. In recent years, we've already noticed a lot of trusted publications decline, and they've had massive layoffs, and we're seeing growing news deserts, especially in the US. And as a result, these low-quality, partisan-backed news sites are rushing in to fill the void. A lot of these sites have always existed, but we've really noticed in the past couple of years, AI has turbocharged this problem. So as of today, the number of partisan-backed news outlets, many of which rely on AI to produce content, now outnumbers the number of remaining newspapers left in the US. And this is, really concerning, especially in an election year where we're seeing these bad actors weaponize the trust and take advantage of the trust that local communities place in news publications and use that to advance, partisan-backed news. And this is a graph here showing the comparison of local newspapers in the US versus these pink slime sites that are AI generated. As of last week, that count officially surpasses the newspapers.
Wow, thank you so much. I want to go back to that slide. That's a crazy point. We've actually had a question come in directly for you, Mackenzie, during this that I thought I'd just put in, which is, and I think Fran wants to answer that as well. But are search engines indexing these sites? How are search engines interacting with these sites?
Yeah, we've noticed what's interesting is a lot of these websites are actually appearing on Google News and being verified as trusted Google News publications, which actually appears to violate their policies against spam and manipulating search results. So we're seeing that as well. But they're a lot more searchable and findable via Yandex and DuckDuckGo and some of those search engines with less safeguards on them.
Thank you very much. Fran, did you? I noticed that you'd clicked a little button to Bagsy this question. You're on mute, Fran.
I did by mistake because I was trying to
launch in without
No, but what I wanted to say, there's a question that is relevant there, like are these pink slime sites primarily right-leaning or left-leaning? They're both. So we did a study on that, and they appear to be on both sides. Obviously, there's a very different dynamic for the pink slime websites and the network that picked them up, depending on whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning. When we did the study on that, it's almost like a year ago now. One of the things that we saw is that the left-leaning networks and the right-leaning networks that pick up those websites, they tend to have different footprints in terms of engagement and in terms of reach. So the left-leaning networks tend to be more open and have a wider engagement, whereas the conservative or right-leaning networks tend to be more closed up, but show a higher engagement. So one tends to have a higher, more general kind of like mainstream reach, whereas the right-leaning one tends to be more closed up and more kind of like inward looking. And that obviously has consequences in terms of like what goes viral and to whom. So I think the pink slimes get picked up by Google, but they also end up in the hands of partisan networks of people that buy into those, and therefore they spread them in the specific way that their kind of like affiliation kind of like commands them to do, in terms of like in terms of someone directing them, but in terms of the inherent shape of a left-leaning versus a right-leaning network.
I did it then as well. I muted myself and started talking without unmuting. I'm noticing that we're coming up to the hour. So if there's anyone that needs to go, I've noticed also that the questions that we've got are anonymous. So if you want to pop in the chat directly to me, if you want to be able to leave but get those questions answered, do feel free. We'll answer maybe one, maybe two more questions over the hour, just in the next couple of minutes. But yeah, if you want to get those sent to you, please do type in the chat your name, at least privately to me, so that I can get that answer to you. It will also be available in the recording. So someone here, this might be a bit of a question for Chris, but I think Mackenzie, you might know a bit about the regulation side of this as well. Currently, all major available AI models are trained on stolen work without compensation using web scraping and other low data integrity methods. Do you think that legislation that mandates compensation for training data would improve the accuracy and reduce hallucinations, as the data set will be smaller, better selected, and more accurate?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I think probably the answer is not necessarily. This is one of the fundamental flaws of generative AI. For those who don't know, hallucinations, or sometimes they're called confabulations, whichever you pick doesn't really matter, but hallucinations kind of imbues AI with human qualities, which a lot of people actually really dislike. The idea of kind of anthropomorphizing this technology. It's essentially making up facts to hide gaps in its quote unquote knowledge. And it is a big issue, particularly when we're talking about using this stuff in business, in enterprise, in government decisions, in journalism, and all of this stuff. Think of kind of AI as like an overconfident Oxbridge graduate. Apologies to all those who are Oxbridge graduates on the call, but a newly minted Oxbridge graduate who thinks that they know everything. They don't, and then they will answer in confidence the things that they don't know by just making it up. I don't know if kind of crunching down the training data will necessarily help with that, in large part just because this is kind of a fundamental flaw with this stuff, in that it will potentially reinforce the training knowledge and make it more tightly argued, but it will also, I suppose, increase the number of areas that the model doesn't feel confident in replying about. And this is kind of one of the big issues that I think has to be sort of sorted. The kind of really briefly, because I know we're running over time, the kind of silver bullet that's meant to kind of solve this amongst people who think this is RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, which is essentially you insert a kind of search engine check midway through the process. So if you're at all interested in this, I did a story for Ars Technica on this about 2 weeks ago. On RAG and how it works, but even then it's kind of not perfect. So I think this is kind of just an issue that we have to live with for the foreseeable future with generative AI.
Thank you so much. I'm noticing that we're going over. I wanted to thank you. Mackenzie, would you like to contribute to that answer?
No, I think I agree with everything Chris.
I just wanted to add that we're running out of data. So
we're running out of data. Yeah, we're running out of training data.
But don't pay for it. I think
yeah,
we're going to see it's likely that we're going to see a slowdown in the progress and speed of the large models, just because there isn't enough new data to make such a difference as we've seen with the current ones. And we're probably going to see a lot more focus on smaller models and focus on specific tasks where there's more kind of like specific data sets that are also not publicly available that can help with that. So that will probably change also how we affect regulation.
I think it's interesting as well because new content now comes in a post-AI age. And Mackenzie, I think we've spoken very, very briefly before, but about like AI cannibalization and kind of AI on top of AI on top of AI. I find that very interesting, but I mean, maybe we could do a whole other webinar on that. But
cannibal AI, right? Let's do it.
Yeah, the cannibal will reunite. Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Mackenzie, for presenting that research on the misinformation in AI. I think it's so interesting, and it's so stark and bleak that there's more of these terrible bad actor websites than there are surviving local newspapers. That is absolutely devastating. But yeah, thank you for that research. It's super insightful, and anyone who has any questions, please do reach out to us, and we can put people in touch with the relevant people to make sure our research goes in the right areas. There were a couple more questions, but I think we kind of answered them circumventively. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all three of you for being able to join us today and kind of give us your expertise and your really unique insights. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. See you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.